The first time my mother-in-law handed me a name tag and called it help, it happened in the hotel lobby while I was adjusting the clasp on my bracelet. The lobby smelled faintly like polished wood and white flowers. Somewhere behind me, glassware was being unloaded onto rolling carts. People were arriving in dark suits and long dresses, speaking in that low, careful way people do when they want to sound important in public. Then she stepped in front of me, smiled, and pressed the tag into my hand. It said event staff. She didn't lower her voice. "We all have to do our part tonight, sweetheart." My husband was standing a few feet away near the bar, laughing with two men from his firm. He looked over, saw the tag, and gave the kind of short, amused smile that disappears quickly if you call attention to it. Then he turned back to his conversation. I pinned the tag onto my dress without saying anything. At the time, I already had 2 folders, one external drive, and a phone call scheduled for the following morning with a woman named Linda Perez. But in that lobby, none of that showed on my face. I just thanked the girl at check-in when she moved aside for me, and I walked toward the ballroom. My name is Naomi Mercer. I was 38 years old then, and I had been married for almost 7 years. My husband, Grant, worked in private wealth law at a firm in Boston that had been around long enough to have portraits of dead founding partners in the main conference room. He liked institutions. He liked old names, old rules, old rooms where people said very little and decided very expensive things. He also liked saying he took care of everything. That included, in his view of me. I ran a business advisory firm called Mercer Ledger. I started it with one client and a rented office above a locksmith in Cambridge. By the time this happened, I had 19 active accounts, 3 analysts, and enough referrals that I had stopped advertising almost a year earlier. Most of our clients were small or mid-sized businesses that had one thing in common. Nobody had looked carefully at the numbers until things were already starting to lean. A restaurant in Somerville losing money on delivery orders nobody had priced correctly. A family hardware store in Quincy where inventory shrinkage had quietly turned into a 6-figure problem. A landscaping company whose office manager had been paying the same vendor twice under 2 separate names for almost 18 months. I was good at finding what didn't belong. Grant called it my little turnaround project once at dinner. He said it casually while reaching for the salt. His mother, Eleanor, didn't say anything. She just took a sip of water and looked down at her plate in a way that made agreement feel cleaner than words. That was 3 years before the gala. By the 6th year of my marriage, I had stopped expecting warmth from her. What I had not stopped expecting, at least not yet, was basic respect. That was my mistake. Respect and performance can look similar from a distance, especially inside families that care a great deal about appearances. The gala itself was for the Ashcroft Family Foundation, which Eleanor chaired and my brother-in-law chaired in practice whenever photographers were nearby. It was their annual black tie fundraiser. Arts access, youth programming, community grants. The usual language was printed in silver lettering on cream cardstock. Grant's invitation had come addressed only to him. When I asked about that, he said it must have been a clerical oversight. I remember the exact moment because we were in the kitchen and the dishwasher was running. I was slicing lemons for water. He said it without looking up from his phone. A clerical oversight. I said, that seems like a strange oversight. He shrugged. You're still coming. I dried my hands and said nothing after that. But later that night, after he went upstairs, I opened my laptop at the dining table and pulled up 3 months of statements from our joint account. The first discrepancy had been small enough that another person might have ignored it. A transfer to a consulting entity I didn't recognize. Then a repeating payment coded as administrative services. Then another. The amount changed, but the timing didn't. Every few weeks. Quiet. Clean. Easy to miss if you were scanning. Harder to miss if numbers were your profession. I did not confront him. That is one thing people misunderstand about patience. They think it means indecision. Sometimes it just means you know better than to interrupt a pattern before you understand it. So I kept working. I built one folder for the transfers moving out of our account. Then another for the foundation filings I had started reviewing for a nonprofit client and, later, for myself. The 2 things were not identical. They did, however, have a familiar shape. Missing detail. Repeated names. Charges routed through entities that seemed to exist mostly on paper. Nothing dramatic. Not at first. Just enough to make me sit still in my chair and read everything twice. The ballroom doors were open when I entered that night. I could hear silverware being set against china, soft and rhythmic. The chandeliers were already lit. Near the stage, a quartet was tuning their instruments. My seat, if you could call it that, was not at the family tables near the center. It was a single-place setting beside the service station near the back wall. I stood there for a moment with the name tag pinned neatly to my dress and looked across the room at the head table where my husband had already taken his seat. Then I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. A server came by a few minutes later and asked if I was covering the dessert rotation. He said it politely. He wasn't being rude. That almost made it worse. I told him no, I was a guest, and he apologized at once. I said it was fine, because by then I understood something clearly. The humiliation had not been improvised. It had been arranged. The seating card, the missing invitation, the printed badge, the distance between my chair and the family tables. None of that happened by accident. So I sat there and watched. That was something I had gotten good at over the years. Watching first, talking later. From where I was, I could see Eleanor making her way from table to table with that polished, measured grace she used in public. One hand lightly touching a shoulder, then an elbow, then the edge of a chair. She made everyone feel selected. My brother-in-law, Adrian, was near the auction display, laughing too loudly with a real estate developer I recognized from the business pages. Grant was moving between donors and partners from his firm, glass in hand, smiling with the easy confidence of someone who believed the room was built for him. The lighting in the ballroom was warm and flattering. Gold on glass, gold on silver, gold on the faces of people who had written checks large enough to be thanked by first name. I sat near the service door and listened to trays clink behind me. My marriage had not started like this. That is the part people always want simplified. They want a single turning point, a clean before and after. But most bad marriages do not break in one loud moment. They narrow over time. A remark here, a correction there, a decision made for you, then another, until one day you realize you have been standing inside someone else's version of your life for years, explaining it to yourself as compromise. When I married Grant, I thought he was steady, thoughtful, controlled in a way that made me feel safe. He remembered details. How I took my coffee, which side of the bed I preferred, the fact that I hated being late to anything. If we were invited somewhere, he was ready before I was. She's polished. Coat on, keys in hand. It took me longer than it should have to understand that control can look like reliability when it is still being offered as care. After we married, he began taking over practical things in the name of efficiency. He set up our household accounts. He suggested we simplify bill payments through one shared system. He said there was no reason for both of us to spend time tracking the same expenses. I was busy growing my firm. He was busy at his. It sounded reasonable. And because it sounded reasonable, I agreed. I still contributed. Half the down payment on the townhouse in Back Bay had come from me. So had monthly transfers into the joint account, regular and documented. I paid for a kitchen renovation 2 years in. I covered a property tax shortfall the year interest rates shifted, and he said cash was temporarily tight because of an investment schedule. I did not object because I had the money and because marriage, as I understood it then, included periods where one person carried more. What I did not know was that he had mistaken my willingness for inattention. The first time I truly looked, I was reviewing quarterly cash flow for one of my clients, a veterinary practice with a payroll leak hidden in reimbursement categories. I came home late, opened our banking dashboard to transfer money for a contractor invoice, and saw a withdrawal I didn't recognize. $4,800. Not enormous, just unfamiliar. The recipient was an entity called Balmer Advisory Group. I assumed, at first, that it was some professional service connected to his work. But when I searched the name, nothing useful came up. No proper site, no clear business registration attached to the profile that surfaced publicly. Just a thin digital footprint and a mailing address tied to a commercial mailbox facility. That was when I started a spreadsheet. Date, amount, source account, destination, description code, frequency. I went back 18 months, then 3 years, then farther. The pattern changed as I widened the range, but it did not disappear. Some transfers were direct. Some moved through payment processors. A few were disguised inside what looked like routine household management. By the end of the first week, I had enough rows highlighted in yellow to know I wasn't looking at sloppiness. I was looking at design. That was when I called Linda Perez. Linda was a forensic accountant I knew through a distressed hospitality case we had both worked on 2 years earlier. She had spent 11 years with the Treasury Department before going private, and she had a habit I trusted. When something was bad, she never rushed to say so. She got quieter. I met her in her office on a Thursday afternoon with printed statements in a gray file box and a yellow legal pad on my lap. She read for 40 minutes without interrupting. At one point, the radiator clicked twice behind her desk. Someone in the hallway walked past in hard shoes. Linda turned one page, then another. Finally, she took off her glasses and set them down very carefully. "This isn't marital carelessness," she said. I remember looking at the grain of the desk instead of at her face. "What is it?" I asked. "It's routing," she said. "It's controlled movement. And unless he has a documented disclosure you haven't mentioned, it's likely fraud." She did not say likely by accident. She said it because she was precise. I asked her what I needed to do next. She gave me 3 steps. First, copy everything and store it somewhere he could not access. Second, stop reacting in real time. No confrontation. No questions. No change in routine. Third, widen the review to include connected entities, not just household accounts. I wrote all 3 down. Then I went home, made dinner, asked Grant whether traffic had been bad, and listened to him talk for 12 minutes about a partner meeting while I passed him the salt. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the study with the small desk lamp on and opened the foundation records. And that was when the second pattern began to show itself. Then I waited. The Ashcroft Family Foundation looked polished from the outside. That was part of what made it effective. Its website showed smiling students holding paintbrushes, recital programs, classroom photos, grant language that sounded generous and specific. Annual reports were laid out on thick digital pages with muted colors and careful typography. Every public document suggested discipline, legacy, stewardship. Eleanor understood presentation better than most people I knew. She knew exactly how much detail to provide before people stopped asking for more. What caught my attention was not one large problem. It was repetition. A consulting fee listed 1 year, then again the next, paid to an LLC with a name so generic it sounded invented in a rush. Program disbursements tied to organizations that had no visible staff, no proper board, no real public history. Expenses marked as youth arts outreach in districts where, after some quiet checking, no one I contacted had any record of the programs ever operating. I did not start with suspicion toward the foundation. I started with familiarity. Once you spend enough time inside financial cleanup work, you begin to recognize when numbers have been arranged for appearance rather than function. The amounts were plausible. The wording was careful. The cadence was wrong. I began building a second file. Not on our home network. Not in cloud storage Grant might have known about. On an encrypted external drive I kept in a locked cabinet at the office behind archived client binders. Every time I found something worth preserving, I saved it twice. PDF copy. Screenshot. Notes beneath it in plain language. Date accessed. Source. Cross-reference. I was methodical because I had learned, long before my marriage started narrowing, that clarity is easier to defend than emotion. The first folder was for our accounts. The second was for the foundation. I did not merge them. Not yet. At work, life remained ordinary on the surface. My office smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and the cedar cleaner our building manager used on Fridays. My analysts came in at 9. Phones rang. Reports went out. I met with a bakery owner who kept twisting his wedding band while we talked through labor costs. I reviewed payroll irregularities for a small construction client in Dorchester. I answered emails. I signed checks. I kept moving. At home, Grant remained exactly as he had been. That was useful. People reveal more when they think the system around them is still holding. He continued to manage our social calendar, continued to talk about donor dinners and firm politics and the burden of dealing with people who, in his words, didn't understand how the world actually worked. When he spoke that way, his mother usually agreed with silence before she agreed with words. A week before the gala, we had dinner at Eleanor's apartment. She lived in a high-rise facing the public garden, the kind of building where the lobby flowers were changed before they had time to fade. Her dining room always smelled faintly like linen spray and whatever had been roasting for too long in the kitchen. That night it was sea bass, lemon, and something buttery underneath it. Adrian was there with his wife, Claire. Claire had been in the family 6 years and had perfected the careful posture of someone who understood that speaking freely carried consequences. She was kind in quiet ways, refilling my water before I asked, texting me once after a hard Christmas to say she was sorry about the comment Eleanor had made about my work schedule. Never enough to provoke open conflict, just enough to tell me I was not imagining things. That night, Eleanor mentioned the gala while the plates were being cleared. "We'll need everyone aligned," she said, folding her napkin beside her plate. "These events only work when family understands its role." Grant nodded before I said anything. Claire glanced at me, then down at her glass. I said, "What exactly do you need from me?" Eleanor smiled. "Just support, presence, flexibility." The words were smooth. The meaning was not. On the drive home, Grant told me I was reading too much into her tone. I watched the lights slide across the windshield and said, maybe. But I was no longer interested in tone. I was interested in records. The next morning, before the office fully filled, I called 2 school administrators whose districts had appeared in the foundation's public materials. I kept the questions simple. Had they ever received grant funds from the Ashcroft Foundation for Youth Arts Programming? Did they recognize the partner organizations listed in the annual report? Had any staff worked with those programs directly? One answered immediately. One called back just after lunch. Neither had any idea what I was talking about. That afternoon, I sat at my desk with the blinds half open and wrote down the rules that had begun forming in my head. Step 1, confirm what is real. Step 2, separate what is provable from what is suspicious. Step 3, move only when the paperwork can move without me. Once I had that, I stopped feeling confused. I wasn't trapped in a hostile family dynamic anymore. I was managing 2 financial systems with overlapping concealment patterns. That was work I understood. The day before the gala, Linda called to say she had traced one of the shell entities connected to our joint account to a private investment account held solely in Grant's name. She did not sound surprised. Neither did I. How much? I asked. There was a pause, paper moving on her desk. So far, she said, just over 300,000. I thanked her, wrote the number down, and put the phone face down. That evening, Grant left early for what he said was event setup. I stood in the bedroom holding a black dress I had worn once to a client dinner and listened to the front door close downstairs. Then I opened my desk drawer, checked that the external drive was still there, and waited. I arrived at the hotel alone a little before 7. The air outside had that sharp October edge Boston gets when the sun is down, but the sidewalks still hold a little warmth from the day. Inside, the lobby was bright and overconditioned. Marble floors, brass trim, quiet music I couldn't quite place. A line of floral arrangements near the entrance, white orchids and dark greenery, arranged to look effortless in the expensive way that never is. Then Eleanor appeared, and the name tag was in my hand, and the evening became clear. After I took my seat by the service station, I did not cry. I did not leave right away either. I sat there for nearly 40 minutes and let the room explain itself. A donor stopped by my table once, looked at the tag, and asked whether someone could point him toward the silent auction forms. A junior associate from Grant's firm glanced at me, recognized me, then looked away so quickly it was almost tender. One of the waitstaff asked whether my table needed resetting because no one else had been seated there. I told him no. Each small moment did its work. Humiliation is different when it happens in private. In private, people can later argue about tone, intent, misunderstanding. In a ballroom full of witnesses, things become cleaner. There is less room for revision. I watched Grant laugh at something one of the senior partners said. I watched Eleanor guide a retired judge to a seat with a hand at his elbow. I watched Adrian stand near the podium looking satisfied in the way men do when they think the night is proving something about their importance. And somewhere in those 40 minutes, the emotion went out of it. Not the pain, the confusion. That left me with order. I slipped my phone from my bag under the table and opened the note I had written that afternoon. It was not dramatic. Just a short sequence, the way I sometimes structured difficult client actions before a meeting. Step 1. Leave the room with dignity. Step 2. Initiate legal protection before morning. Step 3. Send the foundation records where they cannot be privately buried. I read it once. Then I locked my phone and put it away. Silence is useful when you know what comes next. I unpinned the name tag and held it in my hand for a moment. It was cheap cardstock, edges already softening slightly where my fingers had pressed it. Black block letters. Event staff. The thing itself was small. That was part of the insult. They had tried to reduce me with something disposable. I set it beside my water glass and stood up. Walking across a ballroom alone is a strange experience. People notice movement before they understand meaning. Heads turned, then turned back, then turned again when they saw I was heading toward the front of the room with no hesitation at all. Grant was midway through a conversation with a senior partner and 2 donors when I reached the table. Eleanor was seated 3 chairs down. Adrian had just returned from the stage. Claire looked at me first, and in her face I saw recognition before anyone else realized what was happening. I placed my hand lightly on the back of an empty chair and said, in a normal voice, "Grant, I need a moment." The partners stepped back at once. People with real institutional instincts can sense procedural danger before they know its source. Grant gave a tight smile. "Can this wait?" "No," I said. "It can't." The room around us didn't go fully silent, but the sound changed. Conversations thinned. Silverware settled. A nearby laugh ended halfway through. I took off my wedding ring and set it on the white tablecloth in front of him. The sound it made was very soft. That was enough. "I won't be coming home tonight," I said. "Or after tonight." His expression changed, but only slightly at first. Confusion. Calculation. Then the first flicker of concern. Eleanor said my name in that low warning tone she used when she wanted to remind people of hierarchy. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Grant. "Whatever you thought this evening would establish," I said, "it established something else." I left it there. No speech. No accusation. No public explanation. Because the ballroom was not where the truth would be resolved. The ballroom was only where the fiction ended. I turned and walked back the way I had come, past the auction tables, past the service station, through the lobby, and out into the cold air on Boylston Street. The doorman opened the door for me. I thanked him. My heels clicked once on the stone outside, then again as I crossed toward the garage. Grant called before I reached my car. I let it ring, then again as I backed out, then a third time at a red light. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove to my office in Cambridge. The building was dark when I got there. Only the security lights were on in the hallway. My suite smelled faintly of paper and dust after hours, the way offices do when people have left and machines are the only things still awake. I turned on the lamp in my office, took off my shoes, set my bag on the chair, and stood still for a moment. Then I started. "First, Linda." She answered on the second ring, her voice clear, as if she had been awake and expecting movement, even if not this exact hour. "It's time," I said. "All right," she said. "No surprise. I'll prepare the transfer summary and supporting trace. Next, my attorney, Rebecca Sloan." I had met with her quietly 6 weeks earlier after Linda's first formal review. Rebecca handled financial concealment cases, partnership disputes, emergency asset orders. She had a calm voice and a habit of saying only what she could defend. She answered on the third ring. "I'm proceeding," I told her. "All right," she said. "I'll file for emergency account restraint first thing in the morning. Send me any new messages. Don't reply to him tonight. I won't. The third step took the longest. I unlocked the cabinet, removed the external drive, connected it to my laptop, and reviewed the folders one last time. Household transfers, entity records, foundation filings, notes cross-referenced to public documents, school contacts, payment schedules, address matches, timeline summaries. I drafted one email to the Attorney General's Nonprofit Oversight Division and another to a federal tax enforcement contact Linda trusted more than she trusted most people. I attached only what was necessary to trigger review. Enough to establish pattern. Enough to force preservation. Enough to make deletion dangerous. I read both emails twice before sending them. Then I forwarded copies to Rebecca and Linda. By then it was after midnight. Grant had called 12 times and left 6 voicemails. Eleanor had called 4. Adrian twice. Claire once, with no message. I did not listen to any of them. I pulled the small blanket from the office closet, lay down on the couch in my outer office, and turned off the lamp. In the dark, the heating system clicked on somewhere in the wall. A car passed outside. My phone lit once on the desk, then went quiet again. Then I waited. I woke up before dawn in my office with a crease in my shoulder and the sound of a delivery truck backing up somewhere on the street below. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just looked at the ceiling and listened to the building settle around me. The air in the office was cool. It smelled faintly like stale coffee and printer toner. My heels were on the floor near the couch. My phone was still on the desk where I had left it face down. When I sat up and checked it, the screen was full. Calls from Grant. Calls from Eleanor. 2 from Adrian. 1 email from Grant marked urgent. Another from his assistant asking whether he would still be attending a breakfast meeting at the firm. Rebecca had sent a short message at 5:42 a.m., filing at 8. Do not contact him directly. Save everything. So I did. I made coffee in the small machine near reception and stood by the window while it brewed. Outside, the street was still mostly gray. A cyclist went by in a reflective jacket. A woman in running shoes waited at the corner with a paper cup in her hand. Normal morning things. Steady things. Then I sat at my desk and started listening to the voicemails one by one with a legal pad in front of me. The first 3 were still controlled. Naomi, call me back. This is unnecessary. We should discuss this privately before you do anything impulsive. By the 4th, Grant's voice had changed. Less irritated. More careful. By the 6th, I could hear that he was frightened. People often think fear sounds loud. Sometimes it sounds organized. Slower speech. Chosen words. The sudden effort to sound reasonable after years of assuming reason belonged only to them. The 8th message was the one I saved twice. In it, he had called me while apparently already in the middle of another conversation. I heard his brother's voice in the background for several seconds before Grant realized the call had connected. I couldn't make out every word. I could make out enough. If she sent anything, we need to know what, then Grant, sharper, lower. I'm handling it. Then the line disconnected. I wrote down the timestamp and sent the file to Rebecca. At 8:17, she called. Good, she said after I told her about the message. Keep all of it. The emergency motion is in. Once the court receives it, we move to the banks. I asked what I should expect next. Pressure, she said. From him. From the family. Maybe from someone trying to sound neutral on their behalf. Don't explain. Don't educate. Don't negotiate outside counsel. I wrote that down too. At 9:06, Eleanor called again. I let it ring out. At 9:11, she left a message. Her voice was measured, but I could hear strain beneath it now, the effort it took her to keep the edges smooth. I think this has gone far enough, she said. There are misunderstandings here that can still be resolved with discretion. Call me before you make this uglier than it needs to be. I listened to it once, saved it, and moved on. At 9:43, my office manager, Tessa, arrived and paused in the doorway when she saw me already dressed and working. She looked at the coffee cup, the blanket folded on the couch, the stack of printed statements on my desk. She didn't ask the wrong question. That was one of the reasons I had hired her. Do you need the front calls filtered? She asked. Yes, I said. No one gets through without my approval today. She nodded. Done. By 10, the day had started moving on its own. Linda called first. One of the institutions tied to the transfer chain had responded to her formal preservation request. Rebecca called next. The temporary restraint was in process. Then, just after 11, a message came from a compliance officer at Grant's firm asking whether legal counsel for either side would be available for records verification if required. That was when I knew the walls had started touching. I did not feel triumph. I felt the way I usually felt when a difficult client matter finally shifted from suspicion into documented procedure. Clearer. Colder. Easier to manage. A little after noon, Claire called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was quiet and a little breathless, as if she were speaking from somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. "I'm not calling for them," she said immediately. "All right," I said. There was a pause. Then she said, "Eleanor's in a panic. Adrian too. Something official came this morning." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of official?" "I don't know everything," she said. "But there was a letter. And Grant got called into a meeting at his firm before lunch." That tracked with the timing. Claire lowered her voice further. "I just thought you should know they understand this is real now." I thanked her. Before we hung up, she said one more thing. "I'm sorry about last night. It was the first direct acknowledgement anyone from that family had given me." "I know," I said. Around 3 in the afternoon, Grant came to the office. Tessa buzzed my extension first. "He's here," she said. "Do you want me to send him away?" I looked through the glass wall of my office toward reception. He was standing near the chairs in yesterday's suit, no tie now, coat folded over one arm. He looked like he had not slept. There was a stiffness in the way he held his jaw that told me he was still trying to keep control of the version of himself he preferred. "No," I said, "but he stays in reception." I walked out without rushing. The front area of our office was bright in the afternoon light. A plant near the window needed watering. Someone across the hall was laughing about something. The ordinariness of it helped me. Grant turned when he saw me. "You didn't have to do this at work," he said. I stopped a few feet away, not close enough for him to lower his voice and make the conversation feel private. "This is where I am," I said. He let out a breath and looked around at the office, at the framed client commendations, the bookshelves, the analyst desks beyond the glass. I had seen that look before. The look men sometimes get when they are forced to stand inside a world they dismissed and realize it has structure after all. "You're making assumptions based on partial information," he said. "And whatever happened last night, my mother should not have done that." I agree. It was inappropriate. I said nothing. He took a step forward. But this legal escalation, the reporting, freezing accounts, Naomi, this affects everything. Heard versions of me that required less listening. He opened his mouth, but I continued before he could rearrange the conversation into something softer. "This is not a debate," I said. "Counsel can contact counsel. Records will go where they go." For the first time, his control slipped fully. "This could ruin me," he said. The sentence stayed in the air between us. Not us. Me. That was the cleanest truth he had offered in 7 years. I looked at him for a moment and said, "I know." He stared at me, waiting, maybe for sympathy, maybe for softening, maybe for the older version of me who would step in and absorb the emotional labor of his consequences. I did not provide it. After a few seconds, Tessa appeared quietly at the desk with a courier envelope in her hand. She didn't interrupt, but Grant noticed the office moving around him without his permission. Clients still calling. Staff still working. Papers still being processed. My life continuing in a system he did not control. He picked up his coat. "You're making a mistake," he said, but there was no force behind it now. "No," I said. "I'm correcting one." He stood there another second, then turned and left. I watched the door close behind him. Then I went back to my office, shut the door, and opened the next email waiting for me. It was from Claire. Attached was a folder export from the Foundation shared drive. The folder Claire sent contained 32 files. Grant summaries, vendor contracts, internal reimbursement sheets, 2 board briefing documents, a spreadsheet with program allocations by quarter. 3 scanned letters of intent that looked official until you read them slowly and noticed they all followed the same template too closely, right down to the spacing errors. I downloaded everything to the encrypted drive, then printed the index and started reading. By the second file, I knew Claire had found something important. By the 6th, I knew the Foundation's public story was weaker than even I had thought. Several grants listed in the board materials were assigned to organizations that had almost no trace outside the paperwork itself. No active board records. No verifiable tax filings I could locate. No operating history. In 2 cases, the listed contact numbers led to disconnected lines. In another, the mailing address belonged to a mailbox service in Newton. One consulting contract tied program administration support to an LLC whose registered agent matched the attorney Eleanor used for private property work. I put the phone face down and kept going. That afternoon, I called Claire back. She answered in a whisper at first, then said she was in her car and could talk normally. I found the folder last night, she said. I only opened it because Adrian told me to print a board packet and the naming didn't match anything else on the drive. Did he know you saw it? I don't think so. I asked her a few careful questions. How long she had had access to the shared drive. Whether she had downloaded anything else. Whether she had personal notes or emails from prior gala planning cycles. Whether anyone had ever asked her to describe programs she had not personally verified. There was a long pause after that last one. Yes, she said quietly. Last year. I gave donor tours and repeated information from the summary sheets. I looked at the line of printed pages spread across my desk. You were relying on internal records, I said. That matters. I told people there were students, she said. Specific programs. I let a second pass before I answered. Then the fastest way to correct that is to cooperate fully and early. She exhaled hard, like someone who had been waiting for permission to stop protecting the wrong people. By evening, Rebecca had spoken to Claire directly. Linda had reviewed the shared drive files and flagged 3 items for immediate transmission. The State Oversight Office acknowledged receipt of my earlier submission and requested a supplemental record set. Rebecca told me to send it through counsel only, which I did. On Wednesday morning, the process started producing visible consequences. First, the temporary account restraint became formal enough that Grant could no longer move money freely through the channels he had been using. Rebecca called to tell me one of the institutions had marked the entity chain for enhanced review. Linda sent me a summary showing the transfers from our joint account over the course of the marriage, with dates, amounts, intermediary routes, and the final accumulation total. Just over $340,000. Seeing the number in a clean report affected me less than I might have expected. I had already been living with the shape of it for weeks. What I felt was not shock. It was confirmation. The kind that settles in your body without noise. An hour later, Rebecca forwarded notice that counsel for Grant had requested all communication go through attorneys going forward. Good, I thought. That meant he had stopped believing he could talk me back into uncertainty. By Thursday, there was movement around the foundation, too. A reporter from the Globe's nonprofit accountability desk emailed our public business address asking whether Harrow Ledger, that was my firm, had any comment regarding emerging concerns around the Ashcroft Family Foundation's grant disbursement records. I did not respond directly. Rebecca handled it with a standard statement, no comment on pending legal and regulatory matters. Late that afternoon, Claire came to my office in person. She wore a navy sweater, no makeup that I could see, and held her laptop like it was heavier than it should have been. When she sat down across from me, she looked smaller somehow, not because she was weak, but because certainty had gone out of her. I brought everything I could find, she said. We spent nearly 2 hours going through her files. She had donor scripts from prior galas, internal volunteer instructions, draft talking points about outreach programs, a spreadsheet of pledged donations matched against grant impact descriptions. Several of those descriptions were tied to the same entities I had already flagged. One file showed a review note from Eleanor requesting that a grant summary be streamlined for donor readability. Another contained a message from Adrian asking Claire not to request direct program photos from one recipient because they're difficult about publicity. I looked at that line for a long time. It was always the same with these things. Not one dramatic confession. A trail of administrative language trying to cover a structural lie. Claire sat with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea Tessa had brought her. I really thought I was helping, she said. I know, I said. She looked up then, eyes bright but steady. What happens if I cooperate? You tell the truth early, I said. You hand over what you have. You stop protecting people who counted on your silence. She nodded once. Then she said, I want to do that. Rebecca arranged it. By Friday morning, Claire had counsel, and by afternoon she had made a preliminary statement. The next Monday, the first public item appeared. Not a front-page scandal. Not yet. Just a measured report in the Globe's Metro Business section noting that the Ashcroft Family Foundation had come under formal review over questions related to grant documentation, administrative payments, and financial controls. It mentioned the recent gala. It mentioned that pledged funds connected to the event were under review. It mentioned Eleanor by name in the 4th paragraph and Adrian in the 6th. Grant's name did not appear in the article, but by then his own situation had already reached his firm. He was placed on administrative leave pending internal compliance review. Rebecca told me that without emphasis, the same way she told me everything serious. There will be attempts to separate his matter from the foundation matter, she said. That may be partly true legally. It won't help him much socially. She was right. By the end of that week, 3 major donors had asked for accounting clarification through their attorneys. A genuine youth arts nonprofit in Roxbury contacted me through the firm website after seeing the reporting. Their director, Marisol Vega, told me they had applied for Ashcroft funding twice and been turned down both times. She said she had always wondered how an organization with so much visible donor support could produce so little visible work. I offered to review their current financial planning at no charge. Not because I was making a point, because that was the cleanest useful thing in front of me. A few days later, something happened I had not planned for. A colleague of mine in hospitality consulting called and said the hotel that had hosted the gala was trying to unwind its standing event arrangement with the foundation. There were vendor commitments already in place for the following cycle, donated auction items not yet reassigned, and a date on hold that the hotel no longer wanted associated with a client under financial review. They're looking for someone legitimate, he said. Fast. I thought of Marisol's organization. I thought of the ballroom, the service station, the white tag against black fabric. Then I said, I may know the right group. What followed was administrative and, therefore, satisfying. One call to Marisol. One call to Rebecca to confirm there would be no conflict. One call to the hotel's event director. Within 10 days, the date had been reassigned. The auction items that could legally transfer were redirected. Vendor contracts were amended. Sponsorship language was rewritten. Marisol's organization renamed the event the City Youth Arts Benefit and rebuilt it around actual classrooms, actual teachers, actual budgets, actual reporting. I reviewed the program documents myself before agreeing to help. The event took place 6 weeks later in the same ballroom. The chandeliers were the same. The floral arrangements were simpler. The guest list was shorter. The total raised was lower than what Eleanor's gala had once brought in. It did not matter. Every dollar had somewhere real to go. Claire attended as a volunteer coordinator, seated at a proper table with the board. I was not on the printed program and did not speak from the stage. I did not need to. I stood near the back for part of the night and watched students from the partner schools display their work along the side corridor outside the ballroom, charcoal sketches, painted panels, a small trio with strings warming up in the adjoining room. The air smelled like coffee, flowers, and catering heat drifting in from the kitchen. Silverware touched china. Someone laughed near the registration table. Marisol crossed the room carrying a binder full of pledge sheets and looked exactly like a person doing real work. That was enough. The legal matters took longer, as legal matters do. But they moved. The asset tracing held. The misdirected marital funds were incorporated into the fraud determination and returned through settlement with interest. Grant gave up any claim to the townhouse. The divorce finalized in February. Eleanor stepped down from the foundation under a cooperation agreement. Adrian retained defense counsel. Claire never went back. The truth did not arrive as one dramatic scene. It arrived the way it usually does. In records. In timelines. In signatures. In the moment institutions stop accepting performance and begin asking for proof. By March, the house was quiet again. One Tuesday evening, I stood in my kitchen with the radio on low, cutting lemons for water, and realized I was no longer bracing for the sound of Grant's key in the door. After the divorce was finalized, my life did not become dramatic. It became orderly. That was better. I stayed in the townhouse. The first few weeks felt strange in small practical ways. Only one coffee cup in the sink. Only one set of footsteps upstairs at night. No second coat in the front closet. I changed almost nothing at first. Then, gradually, I did. I moved the chair in the study closer to the window. I boxed up the things that were clearly his and left them with Rebecca's office for pickup. I stopped setting the table for 2 out of habit. I started cooking later when I was actually hungry, instead of at the hour that used to keep the evening running on his schedule. Some nights I made pasta. Some nights eggs and toast. Once, in early March, I stood in my own kitchen with the radio low and a pan warming on the stove and realized I was no longer listening for a key in the lock. That was how peace arrived for me. Not all at once. In routines. At work, Herald Ledger grew quietly. Not because of publicity. My name had never been in the article. It grew because Linda spoke about our approach at a financial accountability conference, and because Rebecca mentioned us to 2 attorneys who needed careful forensic review for their clients, and because useful work tends to travel by reputation if you do it long enough without trying to look impressive while doing it. I hired another analyst in December, then one more in January. One of them was a woman in her 50s who had been told by 2 larger firms that she was overqualified. I had learned, over time, that overqualified often means a person notices too much and asks questions at inconvenient moments. Those are usually my kind of people. She started on a Monday and, by Wednesday, had found an expense coding inconsistency in a client file that 3 other people had missed. I kept the name tag in my desk drawer at the office. I never framed it. Never turned it into a speech. Never used it as some polished symbol of resilience when clients came in. It stayed where it had always belonged after that night, as evidence. A small object tied to a clear memory. Every now and then I would open the drawer looking for a stapler or a legal pad and see it there. White cardstock. Black letters. Event stuff. And every time, I thought not about the ballroom first, but about what followed. Marisol's students. Claire sitting straighter as she learned that telling the truth early matters. My analysts at their desks. The clients who came to us because something in their numbers felt wrong, and they wanted someone patient enough to find the actual break. In March, Marisol asked whether I would consider joining the board of the arts nonprofit. I told her I would think about it, which was true for about 10 minutes. Then I called her back and said yes. A week later, I visited their office on a clear afternoon. It was in a brick building that smelled faintly of paper, paint, and old radiator heat. Their hallway walls were lined with student work. A cello leaned against one office door. In the conference room, the whiteboard was covered in actual program numbers, school partnerships, teacher allocations, transportation costs, instrument repair needs. Real figures attached to real outcomes. That mattered to me more than any ballroom ever could. On the way out, I stopped in the hallway and looked at a series of photographs from their school programs. A group of children in front of a mural. A girl holding a violin with both hands like it was something newly trusted. Paint-on sleeves. Folding chairs. Bright paper signs taped unevenly to walls. Real work always leaves marks like that. Not polished ones. Honest ones. As for Eleanor, I heard very little after the cooperation agreement. A few updates through attorneys. One brief mention from Claire that she was learning, late and unwillingly, what limits feel like when they are not optional. Adrian's matter was still moving slowly through review the last time I asked Rebecca. Grant sent 3 messages through counsel over the months that followed. Each one tried, in a slightly different way, to reduce the whole marriage to one misunderstanding and one bad evening. I never responded, because that had never been the question. The question had been whether he had seen me clearly at all. By then, I knew the answer and had no further use for repeating it. My life now is quieter than it was then. I leave the office at a decent hour more often. I make dinner with the radio on. I water the plant by the front window before I forget. I keep one shelf in the hall closet empty because I like the space. Some evenings I review board packets for Marisol's nonprofit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea beside me. Some mornings I walk to work if the weather is good. Nothing about that would look dramatic from the outside. That's all right. A settled life rarely does. And not long ago, one of our newer clients came in with a folder held too tightly in both hands and said, before even sitting down, "I think something is wrong, but I can't prove it yet." I told her to start at the beginning. Then I listened. If this story stayed with you, I'd be glad to have you here for the next one. Please like and subscribe, and in the comments tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I hope one of them keeps you company for a little while.